this is On the Rise, Harnessing the Potential of the Ocean Economy. And when we talk about harnessing the potential of the ocean economy, it doesn't have to be that complicated. I'm going to tell you a quick story of someone that I encountered this summer. Half of my family lives in Asia, and I had the opportunity to visit the small island off the coast of Bali called Nusa Lembongan. While there, I realized that all along the coastlines, there were kilometers and kilometers of seaweed farming in perfect rows. I met the seaweed farmer named Norman Jeffrey, and he gave me this really warm smile, and I started asking him about his life as a local seaweed farmer. He told me that he has returned to seaweed farming. I asked him, what do you mean returned? Well, prior to mass tourism in the island of Nusa Lembongan, seaweed farming was the primary income source for most people on the island. And then most people moved to tourism as it was more lucrative. Then, during the pandemic, a lot of seaweed farmers returned back into seaweed farming because that was the only viable option. Seaweed has been removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere for at least 500 million years. And recent studies show that wild seaweed continues to sequester 173 million metric tons annually. I asked my friend Norman if he knew about the superpowers of seaweed that he was working with every day in order to accelerate the climate movement. He laughed and said, no, I just follow the money. So typically, foreign markets take this seaweed and turn it into food additives, supplements, and skincare products. Profits are made far and away from Norman. For him, the labor is intensive, the margins are paper thin, and the farmers also deal with volatile markets. So currently, seaweed profits there are almost half of what they were a decade ago. But now he's working with a local initiative called the Cube Seaweed, and they cut out the middleman and have local tourists directly buy the seaweed in order to keep it in the local economy. So when we talk about blue economy, it's quite simple. It's not that complicated. It has always existed. It just needs to be adequately funded. So I'm really so excited to introduce our next speaker, who will be Ralph Chami. He is the Assistant Director of the International Monetary Fund, who is currently on sabbatical, focusing on his work as the co-founder of both Blue Green Future and Rebalance Earth, global ecosystem service platforms for value and funding a living nature to combat climate change, protect biodiversity, and lift communities out of poverty. Ralph has a growing body of work recognizing the value inherent in biodiversity and ecosystems around the world, including recent papers on blue carbon ecosystem services and whales. So today, Ralph will outline his vision for a paradigm shift to a nature-centric economy, which he also shared in a TED Talk this past spring, and outline the ways in which many of us gathered here today can take meaningful action to fulfill that vision. Let's give a round of applause for Ralph. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to be here to talk about something that, for many of our ancestors, was no new information, but we seem to have kind of had to rediscover it again. So we all know the value of the ocean to our health, so I'm going to focus on the value of the ocean as a living system. I'm not talking about an extractive view of the ocean or of nature. I'm talking about a regenerative view of the ocean and everything in it, alive and well. I will claim it's far more valuable to us than a dead ocean. Let me make the case. So let me put it in context. I'm a financial economist, and I'm trying to create markets around nature that protect nature in perpetuity. But to have a market, we need to have demand and supply. So where does the demand and where does supply come from of ecosystem services? It starts with the predicament that we are in right now, which is self-inflicted. We all know about climate change, but that's a risk that we are facing. That's why mostly we're here. But also there's another risk that is materializing right next to it, which is the risk to nature itself and the loss of its biodiversity. These two risks are interlinked through human activity. So in a sense, this is a self-inflicted wound. Now, in every predicament, there's always an opportunity to fix things and rise to the occasion if we were to recognize it as such. So let's see how we can not only reduce the two risks, but actually marshal a new day where nature and people are center. Let me make the case. So the people that work on climate change, they say, well, in order to reduce the risk of climate change, we need to reduce and offset carbon dioxide emissions. Those that work on natural capital, they want to protect the nature, they want to invest in nature, they want to restore it, rejuvenate it. The thing is that we can't work on one risk and then tackle the other. We have to do both at the same time because we're running out of time. So how do we do the two? How do we tackle both problems at the same time? That is the proposition for you, and that's what I'm going to show you. All right, turns out that the question is right in front of our face. The question and the answer. So here we go. Here's the solution. All right, if we were to invest in nature, that's, some of us call it nature-based solutions. Invest in nature, meaning protect it, restore it, rejuvenate it. We would, by definition, reduce the risk to nature and its biodiversity. But the scientists tell us, and this is the latest IPCC report, says if we were to do so, then nature would help us fight climate change by a minimum of 38%. That's the latest IPCC report. So we have the solution. We go through nature, we reduce the risk to nature, and I'm talking about here a regenerative nature, protecting nature for itself, and nature would turn around and help us reduce climate change. But notice what I used there. I said invest in nature. I did not say philanthropic giving to nature, because we already give a lot of money, some of us, to protect nature, but that money is not enough. That's why we always talk about the financing gap. That gap has to be filled by something else over and above philanthropy and altruism and nature for itself. That's the case I'm going to make today. So is nature investable? The answer is yes. Okay? So how do you invest in nature? First of all, where's the demand coming from? Well, guess what? From the Kyoto protocols, and then we had the Paris Accord, there are commitments to go carbon negative, carbon neutral, carbon zero by a certain date. Let's say 2050. That was predicated on us taking action at that point in time. But as Greta said, all we did was blah, blah, blah. And suddenly that date moved fast, and now 2040, and we continued to talk and do high fives, and now it's 2030. What this is really saying is there's a dire need to deal with the climate risk through offsetting, through reducing our carbon emissions. That is creating the demand for carbon, and that's why the price of carbon, if you were to Google it today on the EU ETS, it's over $100. My own institution, the IMF, says the price ought to be a minimum of 78. Predictions are the price of carbon, ton of carbon, is going to be in the hundreds in the next few years. So we already have the demand. What we need is to unleash the supply. Supply of what? Supply of what my colleague here, Dinah, calls the work of Earth Tech, of nature, to absorb all that carbon. So let's see. Is nature investable? All right, this is work we're doing with the father of blue carbon, Professor Carlos Duarte. Carlos asked me to value the carbon sequestration services of seagrass globally. Imagine. So he has the data, and I'm a professional financial economist. So we did the exercise, and guess what? The value of seagrass is a minimum of $2 trillion. This is not shadow price. This is a market price, meaning this is something you can go to the market and trade it. Not the seagrass, the carbon sequestration of the seagrass. But by the way, seagrass does a lot of other things. It's a great defense against flooding. And when you have healthy seagrass, you also have healthy fish stocks. So there's a food security aspect to this. What else? Coral reefs, they don't capture carbon on net, but they do a lot of other things that are incredibly important for the life of the ocean. And the IPCC guys have estimated that the revenue from coral reefs through tourism and fish stocks and so forth is at least $36 billion a year. What else? Okay, so this is work we did in 2019. I was hanging out with a bunch of scientists, and they were telling me how the whales capture carbon on their body and indirectly through their fertilization of phytoplankton. And I asked them the question, has anyone ever thought of paying that whale for that work? And they looked at me, why would you want to do that? I said, because the whale is working for free, protecting us. What if she could talk? What is the salary that she would ask us to pay? That's how much. Okay? And that's a moderate amount. She would say, pay me $3 million for grabbing all that carbon on your behalf. All right, what else? This is the orphan. This is the deep ocean that belongs to nobody. Beyond the 200-mile zone of every country lies the deep ocean. And that deep ocean has been grabbing carbon since the beginning of time. It has grabbed, since we collected data since 1870, 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent is sitting between 1,000 meters and all the way to the bottom. As long as we don't dredge it, as long as we don't mine it, that's a gift of the ocean to each one of us in this room. This is our bequest of $30 trillion. I better hurry up. I'm told I'm running out of time. I just thought I would do a segue to land. I know we're talking about the ocean. One day I'll tell you a story of how the elephants actually speak to the whales. Scientists have observed that, by the way. Anyway, it turns out that a 2019 paper by Fabio Berzaghi documented that elephants enhance carbon sequestration in the forest by at least between 7 and 14%. That's a Nature article. And he called me from Paris and said, can you value their services? So I thought, well, if the elephant could speak, how much money would she ask for her services? Well, $2.6 million. Okay? But I want you to compare that. That's the value of just in carbon sequestration of an elephant, right? Elephants are poached, killed, and their tusk is sold for a mere $30,000. All right, so what I'm telling you right now is biodiversity of a living and thriving nature is incredibly valuable to us, okay? It's not only flora, it's flora and fauna interacting with each other, creating this beautiful web of life that sustains us and sustains our economies. So what I'm really defining is a new source of wealth. This is something all the island states, if they're here, for example, the Bahamas just made an announcement yesterday by their prime minister that they're sitting on 25% of the seagrass I showed you. If the seagrass is worth $2 trillion, can you imagine what Bahamas is sitting on right now? They're probably the richest country now per capita on this planet. And I'm sure many others here could do the same exercise. But science tells us nature, a living and thriving nature, is incredibly important. People like me come and market value, the services of nature. But is that enough to create a market? And the answer is no. We need a third pillar, and that is who can speak on behalf of nature? Who has the right to speak on behalf of nature? In the case of the seagrass of the Bahamas, it would be the government. Case of the elephants, we'd have to see. Case of the whales, who has the right to write a contract around the services of nature? Once you resolve these three, then you can keep going. But since we're talking about the oceans, I just wanted to come back and say the sustainable way to deal with our ocean is to think of our ocean as a living system, just like you and me. It exists for itself. It's just that it does other things that are of value to us. So even if it did nothing for us, it has the right to exist because it's a living system, just like you and me. All right, so these are some countries that have went ahead of everybody and defined their relationship with nature. Chile, for example, conferred personhood, imagine, on a river. A river in New Zealand has as much rights as you and me. Isn't that beautiful? And you have the same obligations towards it as you'd have an obligation towards the fellow human being. In Costa Rica, they conferred personhood on bees because they realized the value of the bees in pollination. So once you define all of that, we can now develop the market. On the left-hand side would be those countries that are sitting on oceans, seagrass, salt marsh, mangroves, kelp forest, seaweed, all this what they have to do, if you ask me what's the recipe, Ralph, I would say first thing is to do a scientific accounting. What is it that you have and how much of it do you have? Next, you do the valuation. Third, you would do the legal recognition, who can speak on behalf of the asset itself. Once that is settled, then the natural asset becomes a natural capital, becomes a financial capital, and it enters the balance sheet of the country or the community that owns it. Why is that important? Because once it enters the balance sheet, then the demand side over here would take notice of it. If you cannot resolve the legal aspect of it, the guys on this side who are purchasing the carbon credits cannot do it. But when you do all of this, then the demand side would be the corporations, the countries, individuals that want to offset their carbon footprint. They would purchase the carbon, and they would send the money. But the money should, please focus on the middle column, says the money has to come back to look after nature in perpetuity, because we have ethical and moral obligation towards the nature, a living and thriving nature, and has to look after the stewards of nature, and these would be the indigenous people and the local communities whose lives are intertwined with the living and thriving nature. Now, I'm going to go quickly through this because I've run out of time. I've been told here. So there are issues here I just want to highlight for you because I'm being asked that question all the time. Hey, Ralph, you're defining a new market. Are you worried about equity? Are you worried about the carbon cowboys? By the way, they're here at COP27. They're here. They're going out to countries saying, let me buy the asset outright. They do not want to buy the carbon. They want to buy the forest. They want to buy, and my unequivocal answer to you is, do not ever sell the asset. Do not ever sell the asset. You can lease its services. Do not ever sell the asset. Okay? So there's issue of equity. Equity towards whom? Towards nature itself, and there's equity towards the generation that exists today, the local communities and so forth, and we need to worry about generations into the future because we're talking about harnessing the power of nature. We need to look into the future and make sure that future generations would also benefit from it. Okay? Are there ways to do so? Yes, there are ways to do so. And one way, I'm not going to spend time on this, we can create what is called an endowment fund that would protect the asset on behalf of nature itself and the communities that are, whose lives are intertwined with the asset. All right, there's another issue whenever you develop a new market, the issue of transparency. I hear this all the time. Carbon markets are full of double counting. I said, I've been working in financial development for 30 years. I don't know of any market that is a nascent market that was not replete with gold rush behavior, cheating, innuendos, rumors. This is standard teething problem of a nascent market. Eventually, markets settle down on protocols of behavior. Okay? Anybody who studies corporate finance, history of corporate finance, would know this. So, how do you deal with governance? Meaning, if I am Microsoft and I'm buying the carbon of the seaweed, the example we just heard. Okay, I'm on this side, on the buyer side. I want to pay that money to get the carbon, but I want the money to go to look after nature and look after communities. How do I make sure that there is transparency? Well, we can enter it on a blockchain. We didn't have that technology before. Now we have it. And blockchain would make sure that everybody knows who's contracting with whom, where is the money going. Now, once you do all of this, notice, we arrive at the beautiful tomorrow, which I call, actually it's 4 wins, but I got tired, so I just put 3. Who wins from this? Well, the guys who win are the sellers of the carbon services, or ecosystem services, or biodiversity, whatever you want to call it. If it's the government that owns the seaweed, or the salt marshes, or the mangroves, they would see that their revenue is increased, their economy is diversified. By the way, money from carbon is acyclical. It doesn't depend on tourists. It doesn't depend on COVID. It doesn't depend on the business cycle. It's a great hedge for people, for countries. Who else benefits from it? Well, guess what? The Googles and the Microsofts of the world who made commitments to go carbon negative, carbon zero, carbon neutral. What they would be able to say is, hey, I got my carbon credits, I enhanced my ESG score, and I'm meeting SDGs 1, 8, 10, 13, 14, 15. Certainly that is worth to them. They put it on their website, and that engenders more support from their consumers, from their investors, from the regulators, and from their own employees. So these two guys benefit. Who else benefits? The local communities benefit. All right. Why? Because when you create resilience in nature, we stabilize people in their land. How beautiful is that? You stabilize nature, we stabilize people. Because climate change and people on the mobility, people on the move are very much interlinked. We need to invest in nature so that people don't have to be forced to leave their land. We can create sustainable income, meaningful employment, a better life. And of course, the greatest winner also of them all is nature itself, because by definition, this is an economy that is equitable and nature positive. Thank you.
Beautiful, incredible. Thank you so much, Ralph. Ralph, I'm curious, if a whale is worth $3 million for what it does, have you done the math for how much debt humans owe, or it's someone living in the global north? Have you done that math? I'm just curious. And because they're worth something because they sequester carbon, but we output carbon. So how much debt would we owe technically? Yeah, we owe to the whales.
Of
we
course.
owe to nature.
So you take 3 million and you multiply it by 1.5 million whales that we have right now. That's how much we owe them.
Wow.
Yeah, but nature is far more forgiving than humans. So nature is willing to say, okay, you made a mistake, but you need to come home. And you need to come home while you still have time to come home. It's like the story of the prodigal son.
Yes.
You need to come home because nature is always welcoming.
And we ourselves are nature, but we need to ask for forgiveness from the whales. Yes, thank you so much, Ralph.